Welcome back, BIO178. In this video, we'll talk about what local adaptation is and also some of the factors that make it more likely to occur in different species. So first of all, like I frequently do before I give you the definition, I want you to think about what you think it means based on the terms that are there, what you know about adaptation, what you've read. What do you think local adaptation is, or what it means? Okay, so hopefully you've had some time to think about it. What local adaptation is the definition that I like to often use, is it's the fine-tuning of individuals to their local habitats via natural selection. Oops. So if we look at the terms in this word, local and adaptation, so the local refers to these local unique habitats, and the adaptation part is this natural selection. So remember, in the past, we've talked about the differential effects of drift versus selection. Drift is causing non-adaptive changes, whereas selection is causing adaptive changes. So here we're talking about genetic changes that are occurring in different populations that are living in different unique local habitats, and this is all occurring through this process of natural selection. And the result of local adaptation is that it gives us resident genotypes with a higher fitness in their native habitat compared to foreign genotypes from distant populations. So oftentimes local adaptation is displayed in a figure like the one I'm showing here. So on the y-axis, we're looking at some measure of fitness for these individuals. The x-axis is two different environments. So we have, let's actually do this in different colors. So we have two different environments, environment 1 and genotype 1, and I don't have black, we'll do purple, environment 2, genotype 2. So we have these two different environments, and if we look at the fitness of these different genotypes in these different environments, this is where we see that pattern where the resident genotypes have a higher fitness. So if we first just look on the left-hand side at environment 1, what we see is that the resident genotype, genotype 1, has a higher fitness here compared to the foreign genotype, genotype 2. So if we just look at environment 1, genotype 1 does better in this environment than genotype 2. But if we look at environment 2, we see the opposite pattern, where now that native genotype is genotype 2, because that's in the environment 2 that it came from, and now that genotype has a higher fitness relative to genotype 1, which is now the foreign genotype. So overall, that's what this local adaptation leads to. It leads to populations being very well adapted to their unique habitats, but then if you move them somewhere else, they do not do as well because that habitat is different in some kind of environmental factor, and so they have a lower fitness. And so when we talk about these differences in habitat, what are some of the factors that I mean? So first of all, a heterogeneous environment means the environment's different, and that's giving us these unique habitats that lead to local adaptation. I'm showing on the right here one example. This is a map of California. So the land is in the grayish brownish color. And then all the bright colors are showing the SST or sea surface temperature off the California coast. And what this is showing is that along the California coast, we have these persistent differences. That'll be important in a little while. We'll come back to that. But we have these persistent differences in temperature along the coast. So if you're living up here, for instance, you see temperatures around 8 degrees Celsius versus down here, this is near the Channel Islands, you're seeing temperatures that are in the mid-20s in Celsius. So that's a huge difference. So temperature is one example that's often causing local adaptation, and the one that I often talk about because that's the one that I focus on for my particular research. But there can be lots of different factors in the environment that can cause local adaptation, and they can be either abiotic or biotic. So if we start with abiotic, we've talked about temperature is one example, pH is another one, salinity, precipitation. This is not an exhaustive list, but those are a few things that can cause local adaptation. And if we're thinking about biotic things, it could be things like predator abundance, food abundance, parasites, all those types of things. So interactions with other organisms in the environment, if those differences are consistent and different across these unique habitats, then those kind of factors can also absolutely cause local adaptation as well. So if we go back to this example that I introduced in the overview module, plants and fungi are commonly cited examples of local adaptation. Again, this is the example I showed earlier with the two wild relatives of maize, the teosinte. And in Mexico, these wild populations of maize, which are shown on the right, or the wild species of maize, are locally adapted to temperature differences in Mexico. So again, if we look at this map of Mexico with temperature overlaid on top of it and the particular locations where these wild relatives of maize are found, we can see some regions where the temperature is really high, but also some regions where the temperature is very low. So this is another example of how with these persistent temperature differences across the range of the species, it can lead to these genetic differences driven by natural selection. Another example, of course, that I have talked about repeatedly because it's what I'm most familiar with, is these different populations of the intertidal marine snail, where we can see this genomic evidence for local adaptation. Again, this is also in response to temperature. So this graph I'm showing on the left, these are 3 Northern California sites and 3 Southern California sites. And if we look at the either maximum temperature recorded in those sites or the average daily maximum temperature, in general, the northern populations see much lower maximum temperatures compared to the southern populations. And so what this leads to is local adaptation, but importantly, we have local adaptation against a background of population homogeneity. So what does that mean? What I want to emphasize is that when I say that populations are locally adapted, it does not mean that every single gene in those populations is different. Instead, often what you have is something like this FST frequency distribution we've shown before. So what this is showing is that overall, the vast majority of SNPs or loci in these populations, they're very genetically similar. So this peak for this FST is around 0. An FST of 0 means they're genetically identical. So overall, these populations are very similar, but remember we have those few outliers that are way out here on the FST distribution, and those are the ones that show genetic differences that are in fact in loci related to temperature functions. And so those are the genes that are showing this local adaptation. So that's what I mean where we have genetic evidence for local adaptation against this background of population homogeneity. So this again gets back to the neutral versus adaptive loci that we talked about way back at the beginning of the semester. So in terms of thinking about what types of factors make local adaptation more likely to occur, we'll talk about 2 things here on this slide. The first thing that makes local adaptation more likely to occur is a really broad geographic distribution. So on the right here, I'm showing on this map the geographic range for C. funabralis, the intertidal snail that I study. And this particular snail is found from Vancouver in the north all the way down to Baja California in the south. So this species covers a range of about 1,800 kilometers. So this geographic range of this species is very broad, and that's likely to lead to local adaptation because the broader the geographic range is, the more likely you're to have these persistent environmental differences across this range that can then lead to local adaptation. In other words, the broader the range, the more likely you are to have these unique habitats spread throughout that range. So a broad geographic distribution is more likely to cause local adaptation in a species. The other factor that's likely to cause local adaptation is the presence of consistent environmental heterogeneity. And so the key here is consistent. We talked a little bit already about how you can have these different environmental differences in either abiotic or biotic factors. But the key thing to actually cause local adaptation, which is again driven by this process of natural selection, is that the differences in the environment have to be consistent. Because if you think about natural selection being this process of evolution that takes generations to actually cause an effect, the differences have to be persistent. So what I'm showing here is an image of temperature differences that occur during an El Nino event. An El Nino event is a warm water event that occurs often along the California coast. So you can see we would be right around here in a warm temperature region. But El Nino events are temporary. They only last within a year and then they go away. They don't come back for another 10 years or so. So an El Nino would not cause local adaptation because it's a temporal change. It's temporal variation. So that environmental difference will affect the populations in that present moment, but it will not cause local adaptation. It will not cause long-term adaptive changes because the environmental differences are not persistent enough. One other factor that ties into things we talked about previously that also causes local adaptation is a large effective population size. So if we look at this graphic here on the bottom, like we just said, if you have a broad geographic distribution and persistent environmental heterogeneity, that's going to lead to local adaptation. That's what these little plus signs indicate. A large effective population size also is going to lead to local adaptation. Again, if you think about what we've talked about previously with the balance between selection and drift, if you have a larger effective population size, that means selection is going to have a stronger effect. Selection is that process that's causing local adaptation. A larger effective population size also means it's more likely that you're going to have the genetic variation that can lead to local adaptation. So if you have a small effective population size, that's where you see the large effect of drift. Drift through chance can lead to fixation of alleles and a reduction of genetic diversity. So this is another reason why a large effective population size is more likely to give you genetic variation that can then promote local adaptation. And this is in fact the case for C. phenombralis, that snail that I study. This is a picture that I took, I believe it was actually in Mexico. But if you look, there are snails everywhere, which means it's a good species to study. I never have trouble finding them. Actually, that's not true. I have had trouble finding them in some spots. But the idea is these guys are everywhere. They have a really large effective population size. So that is likely to be another factor to lead to local adaptation occurring in this species.